Picture this: a quiet Tuesday morning in Tucson, Arizona. The kind of morning where the desert sun rises slow and amber over the Rincon Mountains, where sprinklers tick across front lawns, where neighbors wave from driveways before heading off to work. The kind of neighborhood where people leave their doors unlocked because they have lived there for 30 years and never once had a reason to be afraid. The kind of place where nothing bad is ever supposed to happen. But on this particular morning, one of those front doors is standing open. And inside, on the floor of a modest Tucson home, there is blood. Not a lot of it. But enough. Enough to make the neighbor who walked over to check in, after noticing the strange silence, the stillness that felt wrong before she could name why, stop dead in the doorway. Enough to make the 911 dispatcher pause mid-sentence when the call came in. Enough to make the first responding officer radio for backup before even stepping fully inside. Enough to tell everyone who saw it that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong inside this house. And the woman who lived there, an 84-year-old grandmother named Nancy Guthrie, was nowhere to be found. Outside, a floodlight that had been mounted near the back door hung shattered, its glass scattered across the concrete in a radius that spoke of force. A struggle. A confrontation. Something sudden and violent that ended before anyone outside had any idea it had begun. Inside, sitting on the kitchen counter exactly where she had left them, were her medications. Heart medication. Blood pressure medication. The kind of pills that an 84-year-old woman takes every single morning without exception, because missing them is not an inconvenience. It is a medical emergency. She had not touched them. And she had not been seen or heard from since. 8 days would pass. 8 days of silence, of dead ends, of a family splintering under the weight of not knowing. 8 days of investigators processing a crime scene that raised more questions than it answered. 8 days of a nation slowly waking up to the story of a missing grandmother, and the daughter who was desperately searching for her. That daughter is Savannah Guthrie. The face of NBC's Today Show. The woman who has interviewed presidents and world leaders, who has sat across from some of the most powerful and dangerous people on earth, who has built a career on asking the hard questions and not flinching when the answers are uncomfortable. Now she was the one who did not have the answers. And she was not flinching. But just when it seemed like this story could not get any more devastating, it did. Because 8 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Tucson home, a ransom note arrived. Not at the family home. Not to Savannah Guthrie, who has both the resources and the desperation to respond. Not to law enforcement. Not to anyone who could actually do something about it. It arrived at TMZ. And at a local Tucson television station called KVOA. $6 million in Bitcoin. A specific wallet address, visible and traceable on the blockchain. A promise that Nancy would be returned safely within 12 hours of payment. A deadline of 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a specific date. That deadline came and went. The Bitcoin wallet sat at zero. And Nancy Guthrie was still gone. Former hostage negotiators, people who have spent their careers negotiating with terrorists, with cartel leaders, with people who take human lives as casually as most of us breathe, looked at this case and said something that should stop every single one of us cold. The person who wrote this ransom note does not have Nancy Guthrie. They never did. So if this is not a kidnapping, then what is it? And if someone went to all this trouble to make the world believe Nancy was taken by strangers, what is it they are so desperately trying to hide? Welcome to Coldcase Crimelab. I am your host. And today we are going deep into one of the most layered, most disturbing, most meticulously analyzed disappearance cases that investigators say they have encountered in years. By the time this episode is over, you will understand why this case is not simply about a missing woman. It is about a calculated deception. A carefully constructed lie. And a crime that someone believed they could bury under a smokescreen of Bitcoin and fake deadlines. They were wrong. But before we go any further, if you are new to Coldcase Crimelab, this is the place where no case goes cold. We do not let these stories fade into the background. We do not move on when the news cycle does. We stay. We dig. We follow every thread until it leads somewhere. If that is the kind of true crime content you are looking for, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell so you never miss an episode. And if this case is already making your mind race, if you already have a theory forming, drop it in the comments below right now. What do you think happened to Nancy Guthrie? We read every single comment. And your theory might just be the one that changes the direction of this conversation. Now, let us go back to the beginning. To understand what happened to Nancy Guthrie, you need to understand who Nancy Guthrie is. Not the victim in the headline. Not the mother of the famous news anchor. The actual person. The woman who lived inside that Tucson home and who built a life there that was quiet and private and real. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. In a culture obsessed with youth, with visibility, with the constant performance of public life, Nancy had done something increasingly rare. She had lived a quiet life. A private life. A life built around family, around routine, around the small daily rituals that give structure to the years after the big moments have passed. She had raised children. She had watched those children build lives of their own. She had settled into the kind of retirement that looks unremarkable from the outside but feels, to the person living it, like exactly what they worked toward. A home they know by heart. A neighborhood where the mailman knows their name. A kitchen where the coffee is always in the same spot and the medications are always lined up on the counter in the same order every single morning. That kind of life is not dramatic. It does not make headlines. But it is real, and it matters, and when it is violently interrupted, the absence of it screams louder than almost anything else. Nancy's Tucson neighborhood sits in the southern part of the city, far from the tourist corridors and the university district. It is the kind of neighborhood that Tucson residents who have been there a long time tend to live in, established, familiar, unhurried. The streets are wide and lined with mature trees. The homes are single-story, built for the heat, with covered patios and rock gardens and the occasional citrus tree dropping fruit onto the gravel. Neighbors here are the kind who notice when someone's lights do not go on at the usual time. The kind who wave across the street and actually mean it. For Nancy Guthrie, this neighborhood was not just a location. It was a life. The kind of life that takes decades to build and that, for the people who love you, becomes inseparable from who you are. You cannot picture Nancy without picturing that house. You cannot picture the house without picturing her moving through it. The kitchen in the morning. The patio in the evening when the desert cools down enough to sit outside. The chair by the window where she read. That is the home investigators walked into on the morning her neighbor made that call. And the contrast between the life that home represented and what investigators found inside it was, by every account, deeply disturbing. The blood was in the interior of the home. Not near an entrance. Not close to a door or a window in a way that might suggest someone had been wounded coming in or going out. It was inside. Interior. The kind of location that tells an investigator that whatever happened, it happened after someone was already in the house. After the situation had already developed into something serious. The amount was not consistent with a fatal injury, at least, not necessarily. Investigators are careful about drawing conclusions from blood volume alone, because the human body can lose varying amounts of blood from wounds of very different severity. What they could say was that there was enough blood present to indicate physical trauma. Enough to confirm that something violent had occurred inside that room. The floodlight outside was a different kind of evidence entirely. Floodlights do not shatter on their own. They are mounted high, typically out of casual reach, designed to withstand the elements. For this one to be broken, and broken in a way that sent glass across the concrete in a spread consistent with impact, it would have required force. Deliberate force. Either it was struck by something, or someone pulled it down, or the struggle that happened inside somehow extended, at some point, outside. Investigators processed that glass carefully. They photographed every shard. They mapped its distribution. Because in a case like this, every piece of physical evidence is a sentence in a story, and the story of that shattered floodlight was one they were determined to read. And then there were the doors. No forced entry. That is the detail that investigators keep coming back to. That is the detail that, when you sit with it long enough, changes the shape of everything else. Because forced entry, a broken lock, a kicked-in frame, a shattered window, tells one story. It says, someone from outside wanted in, and they had to fight their way through the barrier between outside and inside to get there. No forced entry tells a completely different story. It says, that barrier was not a barrier at all. Either it was opened from the inside, by someone who lived there, for someone they were willing to let in. Or it was opened with a key. Or it was already open when whoever came arrived. Each of those possibilities changes the circle of people investigators have to consider. And in a case like Nancy Guthrie's, where the victim is an 84-year-old woman living alone, that circle matters enormously. Because an 84-year-old woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood does not, as a general rule, open her door to strangers. Not at night. Not when she is not expecting anyone. She has lived long enough to know better. She has the kind of life experience that makes caution instinctive. Which means that whoever she opened that door for, if she opened it at all, was someone she was not afraid of. Someone she recognized. Someone she trusted, or at minimum did not feel the need to be frightened by. That is not a comfortable thought. In fact, it is one of the most uncomfortable thoughts in this entire case. The medications confirmed what the blood had already suggested. Nancy had not left willingly, or at minimum had not had the presence of mind to take what she needed to survive. Her heart medication and blood pressure medication were there on the counter, undisturbed, in the exact formation of a woman who intended to take them that morning and simply never got the chance. She was without those medications. For 8 days. In the summer heat of Tucson. At 84 years old. Every physician who has been asked to comment on the medical implications of this has said the same thing. The longer a person of that age goes without cardiac and blood pressure medication, the more dangerous the situation becomes. Not hypothetically dangerous. Actually, medically dangerous in ways that compound with every passing hour. For investigators, that clock was not a metaphor. It was a real and ticking reality that shaped the urgency of their search. To understand the public dimension of this case, and it has a very significant public dimension, you have to understand who Savannah Guthrie is to the American public. Because she is not just a family member looking for a loved one. She is one of the most recognizable faces on morning television. She is the co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, a broadcast institution that millions of Americans wake up to every single morning. She has held that chair through presidential elections, through natural disasters, through national tragedies that required someone on screen to hold steady when everything around them was shaking. She has interviewed sitting presidents. She has broken major stories. She has conducted the kind of accountability journalism that makes powerful people uncomfortable and that audiences trust. She is, by any measure, at the very top of her profession. And she has built that career, in part, on being the person in the room who knows how to ask the right question at the right moment and then hold the silence long enough to get a real answer. Now she was in a situation where no amount of journalistic skill could get her what she needed. No question was going to bring her mother home. No technique, no experience, no professional competence was applicable to the raw and helpless experience of not knowing where her mother was or whether she was alive. Savannah Guthrie went public with the disappearance. She spoke about it with the kind of controlled anguish that people who are very good at managing their public presentation sometimes display under pressure, not cold, but contained. She asked for information. She asked anyone with any knowledge of her mother's whereabouts to come forward. She used her platform, which is one of the largest in American media, to amplify the search. And the response was enormous. Because when a woman of Savannah Guthrie's public profile asks for help finding her missing mother, the story reaches people who might never have encountered the case otherwise. It reaches the kind of national audience that can turn a local Tucson missing persons case into a coast-to-coast search. But here is where the case gets complicated in a way that goes beyond the normal dimensions of a missing persons investigation. Because Savannah Guthrie's public profile, her resources, and her genuine desperation to find her mother made her an obvious target for the person, or people, who sent that ransom note. The logic, if you are thinking like an investigator, is almost too obvious. If someone wanted to extract money from the Guthrie family, the most direct path would be to go directly to the person who has both the means and the motive to pay. They did not do that. They went to TMZ. And that decision, that single, seemingly inexplicable choice, is one of the most important data points in this entire case. Because it tells investigators something critical about the person who sent that note. Either they were making a deliberate strategic choice to go to the media rather than the family. Or they were not actually in a position to negotiate directly with the family at all, because direct negotiation requires proof of life, and they did not have it, because they did not have Nancy. Both explanations are deeply disturbing. The first suggests someone sophisticated enough to try to weaponize public pressure. The second suggests someone who committed a crime, whatever that crime was, and then tried to disguise it as something else to redirect attention away from themselves. Investigators considered both. They still are. Let us talk about the ransom note in detail. Because the more you look at it, the more it unravels. And the more it unravels, the more clearly you can see the shape of what it was actually designed to do. The note demanded $6 million in Bitcoin. It provided a specific wallet address. It promised that Nancy Guthrie would be returned safely within 12 hours of payment. It set a deadline of 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a specific date. Former hostage negotiators and law enforcement analysts who have reviewed the note, and there have been several, because this case attracted the attention of some of the most experienced people in the field, have raised the same set of red flags, consistently, regardless of their background or institutional affiliation. The first red flag is the recipient. In genuine kidnapping cases, the ransom demand goes to the people who can pay. It goes to the family, to a designated contact, to someone who is in a position to respond. Sometimes it goes through intermediaries. But it goes, ultimately, toward the people with the money. The entire logic of a ransom demand is transactional. I have something you want, you have something I want, let us make an exchange. For that transaction to work, the communication has to reach the person on the other side of it. Sending a ransom note to a celebrity gossip website and a local television station is not a path toward payment. It is a path toward publicity. And publicity, for an actual kidnapper who is holding someone and wants to get paid and disappear, is the last thing in the world they want. Publicity brings law enforcement attention. It brings FBI resources. It brings forensic analysis. It brings exactly the kind of scrutiny that makes a kidnapping harder to execute and the kidnapper far more likely to be caught. Real kidnappers do not want to be on the front page of TMZ. Real kidnappers want to be invisible. The second red flag is the absence of proof of life. In every legitimate kidnapping case, and by legitimate, investigators mean a case where someone is actually being held and the demand is sincere, proof of life is non-negotiable. It is the kidnapper's leverage. It is the only reason anyone would pay. You do not send $6 million into a cryptocurrency wallet for a promise. You send it because you have heard a voice, seen a photograph, received something that proves beyond reasonable doubt that the person you love is alive and can be brought home. This ransom note provided none of that. No photograph. No audio. No video. No handwritten message from Nancy herself. No reference to something private that only she would know, something that could be verified and that would confirm she was alive and in the custody of the person making the demand. Nothing. For former hostage negotiators, that absence is not a minor oversight. It is the defining fact of the case. A kidnapper who does not offer proof of life is either incompetent, in which case they are dangerous for a different set of reasons, or they do not have the person they claim to have. The note did not read like incompetence. It read like someone who had thought carefully about what to say, the specific Bitcoin wallet address, the precise dollar amount, the time deadline, but had not actually needed to think about proof of life, because they did not have anyone to photograph. The third red flag is the blockchain. Bitcoin transactions are public. The entire premise of the blockchain is that every transaction is recorded, permanently and transparently, on a distributed ledger that anyone in the world can access. The wallet address provided in the ransom note was visible to investigators, to journalists, to cryptocurrency analysts, and to anyone with an internet connection who knew what they were looking at. That wallet received nothing. Zero. Not a test transaction. Not a partial payment. Not a single Satoshi. The deadline passed and the wallet remained empty. And the follow-up that would be expected in a genuine kidnapping, the escalation, the proof that the deadline was real, the consequences for non-payment, the recontact with new instructions, never came. Silence. That silence is, in the estimation of every investigator who has looked at this case, the loudest thing about it. While the ransom note was being analyzed and the Bitcoin wallet was being watched, investigators in Tucson were doing something that the general public only began to understand the significance of as details started to emerge from the scene. They were draining a septic tank. And they were doing it in hazmat suits. The word hazmat, short for hazardous materials, carries an immediate and visceral implication that investigators are generally careful not to let run ahead of the facts. But the choice to deploy hazmat protocols in connection with a septic tank search tells anyone who knows how these investigations work exactly what kind of evidence they were looking for and what kind of potential outcome they were preparing to deal with. Investigators do not put on hazmat suits and drain septic tanks in missing persons cases where they believe the person is alive and in the custody of a kidnapper. They do not commit those resources, that personnel, that level of protocol-driven forensic search to the operating theory of an ongoing abduction. That kind of search, methodical, intensive, hazardous material certified, is the kind of search you conduct when you are looking for evidence of something that cannot walk away on its own. Evidence of a body. Evidence of physical remains. Evidence of a crime that ended in a way that no one in Nancy Guthrie's family is yet ready to say out loud. The septic tank was associated with the property where the investigation was focused. The details of exactly which property, and exactly what connection that property had to Nancy or to the people in her life, were not fully disclosed to the public as the investigation was ongoing. Law enforcement is careful about that kind of disclosure, and rightly so. Releasing specific details about an active search can compromise evidence, alert suspects, and destroy the investigative advantages that depend on the element of surprise. But the search itself was significant. And the fact that it was happening at all told investigators, journalists, and true crime analysts who were following the case in real time something that the ransom note had not been able to obscure. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie, whoever was responsible, law enforcement was operating on a theory that was far darker than a kidnapping for ransom. They were not searching the area around that septic tank because they thought Nancy Guthrie was alive inside it. They were searching it because they believed it might contain evidence of what happened to her. That is a devastating distinction. And it is one that the existence of the ransom note had been specifically designed, investigators believe, to prevent the public from reaching too quickly. Let us talk about why someone would send a fake ransom note. Because understanding the motivation, understanding the specific psychology behind this particular choice, is essential to understanding what this case is really about. When investigators encounter a ransom note in a missing persons case where they do not believe an actual kidnapping took place, they are looking at what is called a staging event. Staging is a documented phenomenon in criminal investigations. It is what happens when someone who has committed a crime, typically a violent crime, attempts to alter the appearance of the scene or the circumstances to point investigators in the wrong direction. Staging takes many forms. Sometimes it looks like a burglary that was set up after the fact. Sometimes it looks like a suicide that was arranged to conceal a homicide. Sometimes it looks like an abduction that was fabricated to redirect suspicion away from people close to the victim. A fake ransom note is a form of staging. And it is a particularly sophisticated form, because it does not just alter the physical appearance of a scene. It introduces an entirely false narrative. It gives investigators a story to chase. It gives the media a story to report. It gives the family a reason to wait, to hope, to hold off on asking the questions that might actually lead somewhere. And it gives the person who committed the actual crime, whatever that crime was, time. Precious time. Time to dispose of evidence. Time to establish an alibi. Time to let the trail go cold. The choice of Bitcoin is particularly revealing to investigators. Because Bitcoin, while publicly traceable on the blockchain, is also designed to be anonymous in terms of ownership. You can see a wallet. You can see transactions going in and out. But you cannot, without significant forensic resources, immediately determine who controls the wallet. For someone designing a ransom demand that they never intended to receive payment on, Bitcoin is actually a logical choice. It sounds specific, it sounds sophisticated, it creates the impression of a thought-through plan, but it also provides a layer of misdirection because every law enforcement resource spent analyzing the wallet is a resource not being spent on the actual crime. The choice to send the note to TMZ is also revealing. TMZ has a massive audience and a reputation for breaking sensational stories quickly. Sending a ransom demand, they're virtually guaranteed that it would be reported, that it would reach the widest possible public audience in the shortest possible time. And a story that is being reported everywhere, that is being consumed and discussed and theorized about by millions of people, is a story that drowns out everything else. It creates noise. And noise is the enemy of investigation. Because investigation requires signal, clear, uncontaminated evidence and testimony that points in a specific direction. Noise blurs the signal. Noise makes it harder to hear what the evidence is actually saying. The person who sent that note to TMZ understood that. Whether they were sophisticated enough to have planned it in advance or whether they were desperate enough to improvise in the moment, investigators are still working to determine which. They understood that a public spectacle was their best protection. The former hostage negotiators and investigative professionals who have analyzed this case publicly have been remarkably consistent in their conclusions. That consistency matters, because these are not people who typically agree with each other. They come from different institutional backgrounds, different philosophical frameworks, different approaches to cases. But on the core questions of this case, they are saying the same things. One former FBI hostage negotiator who spent more than 2 decades working domestic and international kidnapping cases stated, in terms that left very little room for ambiguity, that every element of this ransom demand was wrong. Wrong in the way that something designed to look right from a distance looks wrong up close. The demand went to the wrong recipients. It lacked proof of life. The deadline was too specific and too short. Genuine kidnapping negotiations rarely involve hard deadlines, because rigid deadlines are bad strategy for the person making the demand. They invite non-compliance and escalation in ways that are not in the kidnapper's interest. And the silence after the deadline passed was the most telling detail of all. A genuine kidnapper who missed a deadline would follow up. They would escalate. They would send a consequence, something that demonstrated they were serious and that the price of non-payment was real. The silence that followed the 5 o'clock deadline in the Nancy Guthrie case was the silence of someone who had gotten what they wanted from the note, the misdirection, the media coverage, the manufactured narrative, and no longer needed to maintain the fiction of an ongoing negotiation. Another expert, a former crisis negotiator with experience in corporate kidnapping cases and cartel-related abductions in Latin America, pointed to the specific dollar amount as another anomaly. $6 million is a very specific number. In genuine kidnapping cases, the initial demand is almost always inflated beyond what the kidnapper actually expects to receive. It is an opening bid in a negotiation. But the specificity of $6 million, combined with the very short deadline, does not read like an opening bid. It reads like a number someone chose because it seemed plausible given Savannah Guthrie's public profile and perceived wealth, without actually thinking through the mechanics of how a real ransom negotiation works. A third analyst, a private investigator with a background in insurance fraud and financial crime, focused on the blockchain angle. The wallet address provided in the note was real, it existed on the Bitcoin blockchain and was publicly visible. But it had never been used before the note was sent. It had never received any funds. And it showed none of the characteristics of a wallet being used for actual criminal financial activity, no test transactions, no mixing activity, no signs of the kind of preparation that someone who was actually planning to receive and launder $6 million would put into their financial infrastructure. It was, in his professional words, a prop. Created to look like a real demand. Never intended to function as one. To truly understand what happened, or more accurately, to understand the shape of what investigators believe happened even if the full picture is not yet complete, you need to walk through the timeline carefully. Because the timeline reveals things that the individual data points alone do not. Nancy Guthrie was last seen on a specific date inside her Tucson home. What is known publicly is that the sequence of events unfolded over the course of approximately 8 days before the ransom note appeared. In those 8 days, the people who would normally be in contact with Nancy, neighbors, friends, family members, began to notice her absence. The signals were subtle at first. A missed call that went to voicemail. A light that did not come on at the usual time. A day that passed without the small routine interactions that had been part of the pattern of her life in that neighborhood for years. Then another day. Then another. In missing persons investigations, the early days are the most critical. The trail is freshest. Physical evidence is most intact. Witnesses have their clearest memories. The window of time in which a living person can be found, if they are alive, is at its widest. But Nancy's disappearance did not immediately trigger the kind of urgent response that those early hours require, because in the beginning, no one knew something was wrong. The kind of person Nancy was, private, independent, not the type to check in every day, meant that her absence did not immediately read as alarming to everyone around her. By the time the neighbor went to check on her and found the front door open and the blood on the floor, that early critical window had already narrowed significantly. Law enforcement responded quickly once the call came in. The scene was processed. Evidence was collected. Missing persons protocols were activated. And investigators began the process of reconstructing Nancy's last known movements, who she had spoken to, who she had been in contact with, what she had done in the days before she disappeared. That reconstruction revealed several things that shaped the direction of the investigation from its earliest phase. The absence of forced entry. The medications left behind. The specific nature and location of the blood evidence inside the home. The shattered floodlight outside. Each of these details, taken in isolation, might have an innocent explanation. But in combination, and this is the thing about crime scene evidence that investigators are trained to understand, they form a pattern. And the pattern they form is not the pattern of a stranger kidnapping. When a missing persons case has the public profile that the Nancy Guthrie case acquired, when it involves the mother of a nationally known media figure, when it generates a ransom note that goes to a celebrity news outlet, when it produces the kind of wall-to-wall media coverage that follows a story touching those particular nodes of fame and tragedy, the investigative resources that are brought to bear are different from what a typical missing persons case receives. The FBI became involved. Their involvement was not announced with fanfare, but it was reported and later confirmed, and their specific areas of focus told experienced observers something about how investigators were reading the case. The FBI's expertise in kidnapping cases and in financial crime, particularly cryptocurrency-related crime, was relevant to the ransom note angle. But the Bureau's broader involvement suggested that investigators were looking at a wider picture than a simple kidnapping gone wrong scenario. Federal involvement in what might initially have appeared to be a local crime indicates that investigators believed there was something at the jurisdictional or complexity level that required federal resources. Whether that meant the crossing of state lines, the involvement of interstate communications in the ransom demand, the specific financial instruments used, or some other dimension of the case that had not yet been disclosed publicly, the FBI's presence was significant. Local Tucson law enforcement continued to lead the ground-level investigation. They knew the geography, the community, the local context in ways that federal agents arriving from elsewhere could not immediately replicate. The coordination between local and federal investigators in cases like this can be complicated by institutional culture and jurisdictional questions, but in the Nancy Guthrie case, the available reporting suggested a working relationship that was at minimum functional and at times deeply cooperative. The public tip line generated an enormous volume of calls. When a case receives national media coverage, when it is on the front page of major news websites, when it is being discussed on social media by millions of people, when morning television anchors are talking about it, the tip volume is extraordinary. People call because they think they have seen something. People call because they have a theory. People call because they are genuinely trying to help. And people call, occasionally, for reasons that are less straightforward. Processing that volume of tips, distinguishing the useful from the noise, following the promising leads while not losing the thread on the ones that do not pan out, is an enormous logistical undertaking. Investigators assigned to that task alone numbered in the dozens. Meanwhile, the digital investigation was running parallel to the physical one. The ransom note itself was subjected to linguistic analysis. Forensic linguists who study the patterns of written communication, who can identify regional speech patterns, educational level, emotional state, and even, in some cases, specific individuals through their writing, were brought in to analyze the text. What they found was not something law enforcement disclosed publicly in detail, but sources close to the investigation indicated that the linguistic profile of the note was inconsistent with someone who had operated professionally in criminal circles. The language pattern suggested someone who had thought carefully about what to say, someone who had perhaps researched what ransom notes look like, who had consulted some kind of reference material, but who had not written them before. That matters. Because it potentially narrows the field of people who could have written it. Tucson is a city that has its own relationship with high-profile crime. But the Nancy Guthrie case had a character that set it apart from the kinds of cases the city's residents were accustomed to absorbing. This was not a crime of the border. It was not a crime of the street. It was a crime that happened in a quiet residential neighborhood, to an elderly woman, in a home that represented the opposite of vulnerability. It happened somewhere that felt safe. And that made it feel, to the people who lived nearby, like a violation of something fundamental. Neighbors organized. There were community meetings at which law enforcement representatives spoke, carefully, without disclosing details that could compromise the investigation, but with enough presence to demonstrate that the case was being taken seriously. There were vigils. There were handmade signs at the ends of driveways asking for Nancy's safe return. There were neighborhood watch efforts and increased communication among residents who had perhaps not spoken to each other in months but who were now checking in, looking out, watching. The faith community in the area organized prayer gatherings. The local media covered those gatherings with the combination of respect and urgency that stories like this one generate, the sense that every camera that rolls, every story that airs, might be the one that reaches the person with the crucial piece of information that breaks the case open. Local businesses put up flyers. Community social media groups, the kind that normally circulate garage sale listings and lost pet photos, were filled with people asking about Nancy, sharing updates, debating theories. The internet has a complicated relationship with missing persons cases. Sometimes it helps, surfacing information that would otherwise go unnoticed, and sometimes it hurts, spreading misinformation that leads investigators down false paths or that causes additional pain to the families involved. In the Nancy Guthrie case, as in most high-profile missing persons cases, it did both. But the community response, the genuine, ground-level human response of people who were frightened and saddened and determined to help, was real. And it spoke to something about who Nancy Guthrie was in the context of the place where she lived. She was not an abstraction. She was a neighbor. She was someone's friend. She was the person at the end of the street whose light was always on in the evening and whose absence was felt in the specific, personal way that only a real community can feel the absence of one of its own. We are going to pause here for just a moment. If you have been watching this episode all the way to this point, if you are still with us and this case has you as gripped as it has us, drop the words "I am still here" in the comments right now. We want to know who is truly following this story. Who is paying attention to every detail. Because the details matter here. Every single one of them. Drop your comment, let us know you are with us, and then we are going to keep going, because we are only at the halfway point of what investigators have uncovered, and the second half of this story is where the case gets even darker. There is always a gap between what investigators know in a case like this and what has been made public. That gap is not accidental. It is deliberate, and it serves an important purpose. Investigators control the information they release because releasing the wrong information at the wrong time can destroy cases. It can warn suspects. It can allow crucial evidence to be destroyed or hidden. It can compromise witnesses. It can tip the hand of the prosecution before a case ever reaches a courtroom. But informed observers, experienced journalists who cover law enforcement, true crime analysts with investigative backgrounds, former investigators who are no longer bound by the restrictions of active cases, can read the available public information and make reasonably confident inferences about what the investigation has likely established. The deployment of hazmat resources for the septic tank search tells experienced observers that investigators had reason to believe human biological material might be present in or around that location. The specific choice of a septic tank as a search focus tells them that whoever investigators were focusing on had access to that tank, which means the search was likely not speculative or generalized, but targeted at a specific location associated with a specific person or property. The FBI's involvement tells observers that the case had dimensions beyond a local crime. The speed with which investigators were able to publicly characterize the ransom note as likely fraudulent tells observers that they developed the conclusion fairly quickly. In cases where investigators genuinely do not know whether a ransom demand is legitimate, they tend to be far more cautious in their public statements. They hedge. They avoid characterizing the note either way while the investigation is ongoing. The relative speed with which experienced analysts connected to the investigation began expressing skepticism about the note suggests that the physical evidence at the scene had already told them things that made the kidnapping narrative implausible before the ransom note even arrived. Which means, in the estimation of those same observers, that investigators may well have known from the early days of the investigation what kind of crime they were actually looking at. And that the discovery of the ransom note confirmed, rather than confused, their existing picture of events. That is a chilling interpretation. But it is one that the available evidence supports. Let us look more closely at the $6 million Bitcoin demand, because the financial architecture of a ransom, real or fake, tells investigators a great deal. $6 million. In Bitcoin. At the time the note was written, that translated to a specific number of Bitcoin units based on the current exchange rate, a number that would fluctuate with the market in ways the person writing the note may or may not have thought through. The specificity of the dollar amount, rather than a specific Bitcoin quantity, was itself somewhat unusual. Sophisticated criminal operators who actually work with cryptocurrency typically denominate their demands in the currency itself, because exchange rate fluctuation can significantly change the value of a dollar-denominated demand in the time between when it is made and when it might be paid. This suggests one of two things. Either the person writing the note was not particularly sophisticated about how cryptocurrency actually works, they knew enough to reference it and to set up a wallet, but not enough to structure the demand the way an experienced cryptocurrency criminal would. Or they deliberately structured it in a way that would appear accessible and understandable to a general public, because the purpose of the note was not to actually receive payment. It was to be reported on and to be believed. The wallet address itself was registered through a standard cryptocurrency exchange. Law enforcement with appropriate legal process can subpoena exchange records to identify the person who created a wallet, in cases where the wallet was created through a platform that collects user identification. The question of whether this particular wallet was created through an exchange with identifiable records, or through a method that preserved anonymity, was something investigators were working on. The blockchain's public nature meant that anyone watching the wallet could see in real time that nothing was going into it. For journalists and true crime analysts who were monitoring it, and there were a number of people doing exactly that, the empty wallet after the deadline passed was the clearest possible confirmation that whatever this ransom was, it was not working as a genuine demand. No one was trying to pay. And the person who made the demand was not following up to make them. A genuine kidnapper watching a wallet they needed to receive payment in, watching a deadline pass with zero response, would respond. The silence was not the silence of patience. It was the silence of indifference. The silence of someone who never needed the money at all. Investigators building a profile of the person behind the ransom note, and there were behavioral analysis professionals working on exactly that, were working from a set of characteristics suggested by the evidence. The profile begins with access. No forced entry means someone with either a key or a relationship with Nancy close enough that she would open the door to them. That narrows the field significantly. Nancy's circle of regular contact, in a quiet Tucson neighborhood at 84 years old, was not enormous. There were neighbors, there were family members, there were the people who provided various services to her home, there were friends from community activities or faith organizations. Each of those categories of person required investigation. Each required the patient, methodical work of interviewing, of checking alibi, of examining the quality and nature of the relationship. The profile continues with awareness. Whoever staged the ransom note was aware of Savannah Guthrie's public profile and presumably of her financial resources. They chose a figure, $6 million, that reflected that awareness. They understood, at least superficially, how Bitcoin works. They knew how to set up a wallet. They knew which media outlets to contact for maximum visibility. That level of contemporary media and financial literacy, combined with the intimate access suggested by the crime scene, begins to narrow the profile further. The profile also includes the psychological element of the staging choice itself. Staging crimes is something that people do when they are trying to misdirect investigation away from themselves. It requires a certain kind of thinking, the ability to imagine how investigators will interpret evidence and to deliberately create evidence that will lead them somewhere else. That kind of thinking is not randomly distributed in the population. People who stage crimes are typically people who have a personal connection to the victim, who have a reason to fear being investigated, and who are intelligent enough to understand that their connection makes them vulnerable. Combining access, awareness, and the psychology of staging suggests a profile that investigators in this case have worked from carefully. The direction is clear. And it does not point toward unknown professional criminals with sophisticated cryptocurrency infrastructure. It points toward someone who knew Nancy. Someone she trusted. Someone who was allowed in. The Nancy Guthrie case exists within a broader statistical reality that Americans do not talk about enough, the vulnerability of elderly individuals to crime, and in particular to crimes committed by people they know. Elder abuse, physical, financial, and otherwise, is one of the most underreported categories of crime in the country. Studies and government data consistently show that the vast majority of crimes against elderly individuals are committed by family members, caregivers, and others in positions of trust. Not strangers. Not random criminals. People who were allowed into the intimate space of an elderly person's daily life. That reality shapes how investigators approach every case involving an elderly victim where the circumstances are unclear. They are trained to look at the circle of trust first. They are trained to understand that the person who presents as the most concerned, the most cooperative, the most helpful in an investigation may also be the person who has the most to gain from the crime going unsolved. This is not cynicism. It is statistical probability backed by decades of criminal justice research. And it is the lens through which investigators look at every relationship in an elderly victim's life when the evidence does not clearly point to a stranger crime. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the absence of forced entry made that lens particularly relevant. The crime was not a stranger crime. The crime was a crime of access. And access, in the life of an 84-year-old woman living alone in Tucson, means people who were trusted. In criminal investigations, the absence of a body is not the absence of a case. This is a legal and investigative reality that has been tested and confirmed in courtrooms across the country. It is possible, it has been done many times, to prosecute a homicide case without the physical remains of the victim. What it requires is the construction of a case from circumstantial evidence strong enough, coherent enough, and supported by enough independent corroborating facts that a jury can conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim is dead and that a specific person is responsible. The famous case of Scott Peterson, convicted of murdering his wife Lacey and their unborn son, is one example that the legal world returns to when this question arises. The evidence was almost entirely circumstantial. The case rested on the accumulation of evidence that, taken together, pointed overwhelmingly in one direction. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the question of remains was unresolved at the time the investigation was ongoing in its active phase. The septic tank search and other investigative action suggested that law enforcement was working on the possibility, which they treated as likely, that Nancy's remains existed somewhere and that finding them would be important both for the family and for the building of any future criminal case. But investigators also knew that a nobody case, while more challenging, was not an insurmountable obstacle if the other evidence was strong enough. The blood at the scene. The staged ransom note. The medical emergency created by the absence of Nancy's medications over more than a week. The profile of access. The behavioral evidence from the investigation. Each of these elements contributed to a picture. And if that picture became clear enough to meet the legal standard, it could support charges and ultimately prosecution regardless of whether remains were ever recovered. Every criminal investigation ultimately comes back to motive. Not because motive is a legal element that must be proved. In most jurisdictions, the prosecution does not have to prove why someone committed a crime, only that they did, but because motive helps investigators identify suspects and helps juries understand what they are looking at. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the question of motive runs in several directions. The most obvious motive in any case involving an elderly person is financial. Elder financial abuse is extraordinarily common. The National Council on Aging estimates that 1 in 10 Americans aged 60 and older has experienced some form of elder abuse, and financial exploitation is among the most prevalent categories. Wills, estates, property, insurance policies, inheritance, these are the kinds of financial interests that can transform ordinary family relationships into relationships with terrible potential. Nancy Guthrie, as the mother of a nationally known and presumably well-compensated media figure, occupied a particular position. Whether she herself had significant financial assets, or whether her death would have financial implications for others in ways not immediately apparent to outside observers, were questions investigators pursued carefully. But motive is not always financial. It can be relational. Old conflicts. Old wounds. Resentments that have accumulated over years. The kind of complicated human history that exists in every family and that most families manage without violence but that occasionally, in the presence of some triggering circumstance, becomes something darker. Investigators look at the relational history of victims and the people in their lives with the same methodical thoroughness they apply to financial analysis. The staged ransom note adds another layer to the motive question. Because if the note was a staging device, then the motive for staging matters too. What was the person staging trying to protect? What investigation were they trying to redirect? What truth were they trying to bury under the false narrative of a kidnapping? Those questions, when applied to the specific relationships in Nancy Guthrie's life, pointed investigators in directions they continued to pursue. Modern criminal investigation relies on technologies that would have been unimaginable to investigators working cases just a generation ago. The forensic DNA analysis that can identify an individual from a microscopic biological sample. The cell phone tower records that can place a device, and by implication its owner, at a specific geographic location at a specific time. The digital forensics that can recover deleted files, retrieve erased text messages, and reconstruct communications that someone believed they had permanently destroyed. In the Nancy Guthrie case, all of these technologies were potentially in play. DNA analysis was being applied to the biological material found at the scene, the blood, and potentially other biological traces that investigators did not disclose publicly. If that material included DNA from anyone other than Nancy herself, it was a potentially critical piece of evidence, a biological signature that could be compared against samples taken from the people in her life, that could confirm or exclude potential suspects in a way that no amount of denial could overcome. Cell phone records were being analyzed for the devices associated with people of interest in the case. Those records reveal not just calls and messages but location data, the towers that a phone connected to and the approximate geographic area that implies. For a phone that was in the vicinity of Nancy's home around the time the crime occurred, or for a phone that was definitively not where its owner claimed to be, that data could be decisive. The digital evidence associated with the ransom note itself, the IP address used to submit it to TMZ's tip line, the metadata associated with the electronic document, the account used to access KVOA's tip system, was being forensically examined. Anonymous submissions are less anonymous than they appear. Every electronic communication leaves traces in infrastructure logs, and with appropriate legal process, those logs can be accessed and analyzed. The Bitcoin wallet was being examined not just as a financial instrument but as a digital artifact with its own forensic value. The creation of the wallet, the timing of its creation relative to the events of the case, the device and connection used to create it, all of these could contribute to identifying who was behind the demand. The convergence of all of these technological investigative streams, biological, digital, geographic, financial, was building a picture with a density of corroborating evidence that, if it continued to point in the direction it was already pointing, would be extraordinarily difficult to refute. Blood evidence is one of the most powerful and most carefully analyzed categories of physical evidence in criminal investigation. The science of forensic bloodstain pattern analysis has developed significantly over the past several decades, to the point where trained analysts can extract an extraordinary amount of information from the patterns made by blood at a crime scene, information about the source of the bleeding, the position of the person bleeding, the sequence of events, the type of impact that produced each stain, and the subsequent movements of people and objects through the scene. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the blood evidence at the scene was described publicly only in broad terms. The specific patterns, the size and shape of individual stains, the presence or absence of spatter, the directionality of any flowing or transfer stains, the distribution across surfaces, were details that investigators held carefully, because that level of detail is among the most forensically sensitive information in a case like this one. But even in broad terms, the presence of blood inside the home, in a location that did not suggest accidental injury, told a story. Blood at the scene and a missing person equals a violent event that the missing person experienced inside that space. That is the minimum that the evidence supported. And the minimum, in this case, was itself devastating. Forensic bloodstain analysis could tell investigators, among other things, whether the pattern was consistent with a single event or with multiple events, whether the blood was the result of a single wound or of a more extended physical altercation. It could tell them something about the height and position of the source of the blood when the staining occurred. It could tell them whether the blood had been disturbed or partially cleaned, and if so, what that suggested about the sequence of events and the actions taken afterward. Blood that has been partially cleaned is forensically significant in a particular way. The effort to clean it up, to remove evidence, is itself evidence. It demonstrates consciousness of guilt and suggests premeditation about concealment. Even partial cleaning that appears to have removed visible staining can leave behind trace quantities of blood that luminol and other forensic reagents will reveal under the right conditions. And the pattern of what was cleaned and what was not, what was targeted for removal and what was missed, can tell investigators as much as the blood that was not cleaned at all. The academic literature on crime staging, the body of research produced by forensic psychologists, criminologists, and behavioral investigators who have studied people who alter crime scenes to misdirect investigation, reveals several consistent patterns. Stagers are almost always known to the victim. This is the single most consistent finding across the research. The intimate knowledge of the victim's life required to effectively stage a crime, to know what will and will not look suspicious, to know what the victim's normal patterns of behavior are and how to represent a deviation from those patterns as believable, is knowledge that comes from proximity. Stagers know the house. They know the victim's routines. They know who will discover the scene and what they will think when they do. That knowledge comes from relationship, not from chance encounter. Stagers are typically under some form of immediate pressure. Staging is almost never the result of a coolly executed plan that was put in place before the crime occurred. It is almost always a response to the crime itself, a rapid, stressed, improvised attempt to change the narrative when the person responsible realizes that investigation is coming and that without misdirection, that investigation will point at them. The imperfections and inconsistencies that investigators find in staged scenes are largely the product of this improvisation under stress. Stagers overestimate their own sophistication. This is perhaps the most consistent psychological finding in the literature, and it is certainly visible in the Nancy Guthrie ransom note. The person who staged this particular misdirection believed that the ransom note was sophisticated, that the use of Bitcoin, the specific dollar amount, the tight deadline, the choice of high-visibility media recipients would create a convincing illusion of organized criminal activity. What they did not fully appreciate was that these same elements, viewed through the eyes of experienced investigators, read not as sophisticated criminal planning but as someone's idea of what sophisticated criminal planning looks like. The distance between the real thing and the simulation of it is visible to anyone who has seen both. Stagers also follow a pattern of initial relief followed by growing terror. The relief comes from the successful execution of the staging, the note was sent, the story is out, the narrative is in place. The terror comes as the investigation fails to proceed in the direction the stager expected, as investigators start asking questions that suggest they are not fully buying the narrative, as the evidence that was supposed to be buried keeps surfacing in unexpected ways. That cycle of relief and terror leaves behavioral traces that investigators look for. And it often produces secondary behaviors, additional contact, additional misdirection attempts, overreach in one direction or another, that can generate new evidence. There is a human dimension to this story that no amount of investigative analysis can fully capture. And it is important not to let the analytical focus on the mechanics of the crime, the ransom note, the Bitcoin wallet, the staging theory, completely eclipse the human reality at the center of it. Nancy Guthrie's family was waiting. Every day that passed without an answer was a day of unbearable uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that people who have not experienced it find difficult to fully comprehend, the way it invades every thought, the way it makes the ordinary details of daily life feel simultaneously trivial and impossibly heavy, the way it holds you suspended between hope and grief in a place that has no name and no clear path out. Savannah Guthrie, for all her professional capacity to handle difficulty with composure, was a daughter looking for her mother. Whatever professional skill she brought to communicating about the case publicly, the private reality of what she was living through had nothing to do with professional skill. It had to do with love and fear and the particular agony of not knowing. Other members of Nancy's family were in their own versions of that same agony. Grandchildren. Extended family. Friends of decades who had shared the particular texture of a long shared life with Nancy and who could not fathom that she was simply gone. One of the cruelest aspects of cases like this, cases where evidence points toward a dark conclusion but no final confirmation has yet been given, is that grief cannot fully begin while hope technically still exists. The family is asked to hold both things at the same time. The hope that maybe, somehow, there is a version of events in which Nancy comes home. And the growing, terrible understanding that the evidence is not pointing toward that version. That is a psychological weight that very few experiences prepare a person to carry. The Nancy Guthrie case, still unresolved in its final legal dimension, but clear in its investigative direction to the professionals who have analyzed it, teaches several things that extend beyond the specific facts of this specific tragedy. It teaches us that staging works in the short term but rarely in the long term. The noise created by a false narrative can delay an investigation, can misdirect public attention, can buy time. But it cannot permanently obscure the physical evidence at a scene. It cannot forever misdirect the methodical work of experienced investigators who know what they are looking at and who have the patience to keep looking. The truth has a way of surfacing, even through a carefully constructed layer of misdirection. Because lies have to be maintained, and evidence does not. It teaches us that the people most dangerous to elderly individuals are frequently those closest to them. The statistics on elder crime, the research on elder abuse, the pattern that investigators see again and again in cases involving elderly victims, all of it points toward the same uncomfortable reality. The danger is not the stranger. The danger is the trusted person. The person who has the key. The person who is invited in. The person whose face and name evoke not fear but familiarity. It teaches us that modern tools, cryptocurrency, anonymous tip lines, social media, can be used in the attempt to deceive, but that these same tools leave traces of their own. The blockchain is permanent. Digital communications leave records. The very infrastructure that was supposed to provide anonymity for the person who sent that ransom note also provided investigators with evidence they could work from. And it teaches us that the people who are taken from us deserve better than to have their disappearances reduced to spectacle. Nancy Guthrie was a real person. She had a life. She had people who loved her. She was not a story. She was not a case file. She was a grandmother. And she deserved the full weight of investigative effort, the full force of justice, and the full dignity of being remembered as a human being rather than reduced to a headline. There is a question at the center of this case that does not go away no matter how much time passes or how much analysis is applied to it. And it is the question that, ultimately, everything else in this story is pointing toward. What happened inside that Tucson home? Not the theoretical version. Not the staged version. Not the version that someone wanted the world to believe when they sent a ransom note to TMZ about $6 million in Bitcoin. The real version. The version that the blood on the floor is part of and that the shattered floodlight is part of and that the untouched medications on the kitchen counter are part of. The version that begins with the last person who saw Nancy Guthrie alive. Investigators believe they know the shape of that version. The physical evidence, the forensic analysis, the behavioral profile, the absence of any credible alternative explanation, all of it points in a direction. Not a direction that is comfortable to say out loud. Not a direction that brings any peace to the family that is waiting for answers. But a direction that is, in the professional estimation of the people who have spent the most time with this case, the truth. The truth is what the investigation is pursuing. The truth is what the evidence is building toward. The truth is what justice, real justice, not the staged version, not the distracted version, requires. And the truth, in this case, is that someone who was trusted, someone who was allowed in, someone who Nancy Guthrie did not fear, did something terrible in that quiet Tucson neighborhood. And then tried to hide it under a headline. They did not succeed in hiding it. They succeeded only in delaying it. And the delay is running out. Every crime of this kind begins with a secret. The secret of what happened inside that home. The secret of the decision that was made. The secret that someone carried out of that house on the morning they left it behind them, a secret they believed could be maintained if the right story was told loudly enough and quickly enough. Secrets have a weight. This is not a poetic observation, it is a psychological reality documented in extensive research on the phenomenology of concealment. Carrying a significant secret, the kind that involves profound moral failure, that contradicts the image a person presents to the world, that would destroy them if it were known, creates measurable cognitive and emotional effects. It changes behavior in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes conspicuous. It shapes how a person interacts with investigators, with family members, with friends, with anyone who might be in a position to notice something. It creates the chronic, low-grade hypervigilance of a person who is always listening for the footstep that might be coming for them. People who carry secrets of this magnitude often describe the experience, when they eventually speak about it, as an exhausting performance, the continuous effort of presenting a normal exterior while managing an interior that is anything but normal. The energy required to maintain the performance is enormous. And the longer it must be maintained, the longer the investigation continues, the longer the questions keep coming, the longer the public attention keeps shining on the case, the more exhausting and unsustainable the performance becomes. Investigators understand this. They understand that time is frequently on their side in cases like this, not because evidence gets better with time, it often does not, but because the human capacity to maintain a significant deception under sustained pressure is finite. People eventually make mistakes. They say something inconsistent with what they said before. They reach out in ways that reveal knowledge they should not have. They change their behavior in response to investigative developments in ways that betray their awareness of those developments. The person who sent that ransom note to TMZ was still carrying their secret. Still performing the normalcy required to avoid detection. Still managing the gap between the interior experience of someone who knows what happened in that Tucson home and the exterior performance of someone who is as mystified and as horrified as everyone else. That gap is not comfortable. And it is not sustainable. And investigators were counting on the fact that it would not be. Accountability in criminal cases takes several forms, and it is worth thinking about all of them rather than reducing the concept to the single, dramatic image of a verdict. There is legal accountability, the formal process of charge, prosecution, and judgment that our system provides. There is public accountability, the disclosure of the truth to the community affected by the crime and to the broader public that has an interest in knowing. And there is moral accountability, the internal reckoning that a person must ultimately face regardless of whether the legal system catches up with them. In the Nancy Guthrie case, all three forms of accountability were in place simultaneously. Legal accountability was the primary focus of the investigation. Building a case that could succeed in court, that could survive a vigorous defense, that could persuade a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, that could result in a conviction, was the goal toward which all of the forensic work, all of the investigative effort, all of the patient accumulation of evidence was directed. Public accountability had already begun to take shape through media coverage and public discussion. The story of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, including the growing professional consensus that the ransom note was fraudulent and that the crime was not what it appeared to be, was part of the public record. The truth, to the extent it was knowable from available evidence, was already being spoken. That public accounting had its own value, separate from the legal process. It served the community's need to understand what had happened. It served the investigative function of keeping the pressure on and the attention sustained. And it served Nancy's memory, ensuring that she was not forgotten and that her story was not reduced to the staged version that someone had tried to impose on it. Moral accountability, the internal variety, is the least visible and the most uncertain. We cannot know what goes on inside another person's conscience. We cannot know whether the person responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie has any capacity for the kind of genuine reckoning that true moral accountability requires. What we know is that the gap between who they appear to be to the world around them and what they actually did is the site of a psychological reality that has consequences, whether or not those consequences are visible from the outside. Whatever the ultimate resolution of this case, whatever the courts ultimately decide and whatever the final accounting of events turns out to be, Nancy Guthrie's legacy is not reducible to the circumstances of her disappearance. She was a whole person. She had a whole life. The decades she lived before the moment that took her from the world are not erased by that moment. They are, in some important sense, everything. She raised children who went on to live remarkable lives. She built a home that was more than a building, it was a place of warmth and routine and safety. She accumulated the kind of relationships that only decades can build, the kind where you know someone well enough to know their silence as well as their speech. She lived long enough to understand what mattered and what did not, to possess the particular wisdom that comes not from reading about life but from actually living it, from making mistakes and recovering from them, from losing people you love and finding a way to continue. At 84 years old, Nancy Guthrie was not at the end of a life that was finished. She was in the middle of a life that still had texture and meaning and the ongoing reality of someone who woke up every morning and was glad to. She was someone whose grandchildren needed her to be there. Someone whose daughter, however busy and high-profile her professional life, still needed her mother. Someone whose absence, the specific, particular absence of her, would leave a shape in the world around her that nothing else could fill. That is what was taken. Not a statistic. Not a case file. Not a headline. A person. An irreplaceable, particular, specific human being who had spent 84 years becoming exactly who she was. She deserved better than what happened to her. And she deserves better than to be remembered only as the victim in the case, the mother of the famous daughter, the missing woman. She deserves to be remembered as Nancy. As herself. There is always a final witness in every crime. Not necessarily someone who saw everything happen. But someone who knows. Someone who has been carrying the knowledge of what occurred in that Tucson home, the specific, detailed, unredacted truth of it, since the moment it happened. Someone whose testimony, if it were ever fully and honestly spoken, would answer every remaining question. That person is still out there. Still living with what they know. Still managing the performance of normalcy that the carrying of that knowledge requires. Still watching as the investigation proceeds, hoping and not hoping simultaneously, hoping that the investigators do not find what they are looking for, but perhaps, in some part of themselves, aware that the weight of what they carry is not a weight they can carry indefinitely. Investigations succeed because people eventually talk. Because the cognitive and emotional burden of a significant secret in the context of an ongoing criminal investigation is a burden that very few people are equipped to sustain without eventually either making a mistake or making a choice to put it down. The choice to put it down, to contact an investigator, to speak with a prosecutor, to take the difficult path that at least ends the performance even if it brings its own consequences, is a choice that the people around serious crimes sometimes make. That choice, when it is made, can change everything. A single credible statement from someone with direct knowledge can confirm what the physical evidence was already pointing toward. It can fill in the specific details that evidence alone cannot fully supply. It can transform a strong circumstantial case into an airtight one. It can bring a proceeding to a resolution far faster than the purely evidence-based path would have allowed. Whether that kind of cooperation would occur in the Nancy Guthrie case was unknown. What was known was that investigators were creating the conditions that make such cooperation more likely, building their case carefully and thoroughly enough that the people with knowledge understood the investigation was solid, creating the kind of pressure that sometimes tips the balance toward disclosure, keeping the public attention sustained enough that silence itself became more uncomfortable than speaking. The investigation was working. The truth was accessible. And the question of when it would be fully spoken, when the final witness would speak, was not a question of if. It was a question of when. For Nancy Guthrie, who deserved better than silence, when cannot come soon enough. We come, finally, to the place where all investigations ultimately arrive. The moment of reckoning. Not the legal reckoning, that is still working its way through a process that moves slower than grief and slower than justice demands, but the moral reckoning. The accounting for what happened and why and what it means. What happened in that Tucson home was a crime against an elderly woman by someone who was trusted. The specific details of that crime, the exact sequence of events, the specific nature of what occurred, the decisions made in the aftermath, are still being established through the formal investigative process. But the broad shape of it is visible. It is visible in the evidence. It is visible in the professional consensus of the people who have examined that evidence. It is visible in the desperate, conspicuous overreach of the ransom note and the staged narrative. Someone did something terrible. And then tried to hide it. And the hiding was, in many ways, as revealing as the crime itself. Because you only hide something when you are afraid of what will happen if it is found. The person who sent that note to TMZ was afraid. Whatever calculation they made, whatever they believed the note would accomplish, underneath it was fear. The fear of being discovered. The fear of accountability. The fear of the truth that the blood on Nancy Guthrie's floor was already telling. That truth is not finished speaking. Investigation speaks slowly. Court speaks slowly. Justice speaks slowly. But they do speak. And what they are moving toward saying, what the evidence has been pointing toward since the first day investigators walked into that home and saw what was on the floor, is that someone is responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie. That someone tried and failed to hide it. And that the hiding did not work. The clock is still running. The investigation is still moving. And at Coldcase Crimelab, we will be here when it arrives at the place where all of this evidence is finally, fully, publicly spoken. For Nancy. For her family. For the truth. We keep going. This has been Coldcase Crimelab. If this episode affected you, if Nancy's story has stayed with you, if you have a theory you need to share, if this is the kind of investigative storytelling that you want more of, then please, right now, like this video. Share it. Post it. Send it to someone who follows true crime and needs to know about this case. Every share puts more eyes on this story. More eyes means more pressure. More pressure means a better chance at answers and justice for Nancy and for her family. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Because we are not done. We will not be done until there is accountability. Until the truth about what happened in that Tucson home is publicly known and legally adjudicated. We will be back with updates on this case as the investigation develops. We will be back with new cases, because there are always new cases, always new stories of people who deserve to be heard and remembered. Coldcase Crimelab is where those stories live. This is where we do not look away. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. For Nancy Guthrie, and for everyone still waiting for justice, we keep going.